Okay, welcome. I guess this is our new classroom. I guess we're online learning. So I guess that's what we need to get used to. So hope you're all safe. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all wearing green. This is today's lessons for, I guess it's Tuesday, March 17th, or whenever the heck you want to watch it. But stay safe out there. So this lesson is going to be pretty short. I'm tired of trying to do this because I've messed it up a lot, but that means that I'm learning. So I'm okay with that. But we are doing the online learning thing here. The goal for the class. So what are we going to do these next 2 weeks? The goal for the class is each week, my goal is to put 3 to 5 video lessons up there, meaning on Google Classroom. We'll use everything with Google Classroom. With each lesson, there'll be some sort of evaluation. It may be 5 questions. It may be 20 questions. It may be a written response. It's not going to be real hard. But I do think that we can maximize our learning in this time. Let's not waste these 2 weeks, and hopefully it's only 2 weeks. But it's going to make me a better teacher, and you're going to get used to learning online, which is probably your college future. So let's talk a little bit current events now. It is St. Patrick's Day. So on our Google Classroom, I will post some stuff about St. Patrick, the great Englishman who became an Irish hero, which is kind of interesting and famous for wearing the color blue. But we now celebrate it with green. So hopefully you have your green on today. Happy St. Patrick's Day. The other thing is the coronavirus thing. Yeah. At the beginning of the year, we discussed there's certain things that you're probably going to experience that will be taught in this class. This is one of them. This is one of the most unique things that I've ever experienced. We discussed a couple of days ago. Is this something that we're overreacting to, or is this something that is the proper reaction? And hopefully we're overreacting. Hopefully we're all a lot safer than a lot of people feel. But just, stay away from people, do what they ask, and the best will turn out from it. We're going to get through it. Just hopefully nobody that we know, nobody in our community is affected, and we pray for those that will be affected. But it's a fascinating time because this will be taught in our history books. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a link to a pretty cool map about coronavirus. And if you like this sort of thing, you can really spend a lot of time on this map. It's an interactive map. I'll show you it here real quick. You don't need to see my face anymore, so we'll see you tomorrow. But here's a map of coronavirus. And what you can do here is you can zoom into any part of the world, and it will tell you how many cases have been confirmed in that region. And the bigger the circle, the more the cases. So it also goes country by country, but also state by state. So as we look at Illinois, this number's over doubled since last Thursday with 106 confirmed cases in our state, 104 of them being active. You can spend a lot of time on this map. There's a lot of good information. And it's, once again, a pretty reliable source with Johns Hopkins. But that's not our lesson today, but that is a little bit of current events. So if you are intrigued by this, you want to learn a little bit more, that's a pretty interesting map that you can dive into. Okay, so once again, this class, 3 to 5 videos per week, depending if they all work. They have not been great with working so far, but hopefully I can figure that out as we go on, right? You learn through making some mistakes. You will have some homework in Google Classroom with each of these videos, with each of these lessons, and we can make this time really productive for us. Our lesson this week is going to be Vietnam War. And today is just going to be a real quick introduction. If you're already tired of this lesson, go ahead and turn on Netflix. And I give you permission, if your parents also give you permission, to watch the documentary, The Vietnam War, by Ken Burns. It is TV mature, so make sure that you ask your parents. There's some strong language, and I mean, it's a war documentary, so there's some strong footage there as well. But the Vietnam War is on Netflix. It's a fantastic learning source. Well done by Ken Burns, but we're going to watch a little bit of that as we go on, or you're going to watch a little bit of that as we go on with this lesson. So once again, today is just part one. What was Vietnam like before the Vietnam War, or as you corrected on my board the other day, conflict? Because once again, it's not a declared war. So where is Vietnam? Well, here we see it highlighted just south of China. It is in Southeast Asia. What was Vietnam like before World War II? What happened in Vietnam during World War II that will lead us to Vietnam being part of the event that we know as the Cold War? And we spent a lot of time on the Cold War this year, so you should have a pretty good understanding of what's going on with that. Okay, geographically, we saw it on the map there, Southeast Asia. The peninsula in which it is located is known as the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. So we're going to refer to Indochina quite a few times. Indochina is this peninsula right here. And Indochina is an important area for trade. As we're looking at the 16th through 19th century, it's an important part for trade, but there are also some different resources that can be found there. The French controlled Indochina at the end of the 19th century, and that's going to be a big part of what we know as the Vietnam War, Vietnam conflict. So that's where it is at geographically. Its weather, it's a pretty humid area. They have what are known as monsoon seasons, meaning they have two seasons. You know, we have the four of fall, winter, spring, summer. They have two seasons, meaning they have a wet season, which is May through September, and they have a dry season, which is November through March. If you watch the movie Forrest Gump, you're going to see the monsoon seasons portrayed when he and Bubba have to lean up against each other in the middle of the night so they don't fall into the puddles. That is portraying the monsoon seasons. And he talks about it. When it rains, it kept raining, and when it didn't rain at all. So if you ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you might be a little bit more familiar with that. We always look at geography because we need to understand our neighbors. And our neighbors oftentimes influence our behavior. Well, in Vietnam, the two largest countries in the region are China to the north and India to the west. China is going to have a major influence on North Vietnamese culture, language, and traditions. India is going to have a large influence on western part of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, as well as the southern part of Vietnam. So the two countries that are going to have a major influence on Vietnamese culture and way of life, and therefore perspective later on in history, are going to be China as well as India. Vietnam has a long, long history of being a colony. We can trace this back 1,800 years. About 200 AD, the Chinese dynasty decided that they were going to expand, and they decided to expand into the area that is present day known as Vietnam. The Chinese dynasty, meaning the family and leadership, had control of one part that is known as Vietnam today for over 800 years. And it's not so much that the Chinese are there to dominate the area, but it just shows today that the culture of Vietnam is heavily tied to that of Chinese culture. The language is similar, traditions are similar, and we'll even see Buddhism become the predominant religion of Vietnam, especially in the north. So a major influence on Chinese culture to those individuals living in Vietnam. Now, China didn't always control Vietnam. It was an independent country to itself, building its own culture, its own way of life. A lot of that changed in the mid-19th century. In 1858, the leader of France is a guy by the name of Napoleon III. And Napoleon III decides that they're going to create an empire. Once again, that's not unique to this time. We've discussed the age of exploration, the increase of slavery, and we've also looked at imperialism. At the end of slavery, countries had to show that they were most powerful. So one thing that they turned to is trying to build the world's largest military. Well, that caused tensions, and that caused World War I. Another thing that caused tension were the alliances that were formed, the desire for their own country to be the greatest with nationalism, but also the desire to have as much land as possible. And in 1858, the French leader, Napoleon III, decided that they would expand. And he eventually sends his generals down to Southeast Asia, and they conquer the land that we know today as Vietnam. What happened from 1958 to 1908 is a series of really bloody wars. The French are in, and they're going to take over the entire peninsula, but it's going to take them 50 years, and it eventually becomes very bloody. Now, once you take an empire, you have a decision to make. How do you treat the conquered people? Not only what are you going to do with the area, with resources and trade, but how are you going to treat the people that are already living there? The French were awful. So over that 50-year period of conquering Indochina, the French started to treat the Vietnamese and all those individuals in Indochina as inferior individuals. And we can see the opinion of the Vietnamese from this quote from one of their emperors. In 1883, the emperor stated, my people live in an era of sadness. I am speechless. I am guilty. My heart is troubled. There is evil in our land I cannot control. Now that means that the French, he's calling the French evil. Somehow we must overcome our fear and woe. Others will follow me. May they work together to regain our freedom. In other words, France is the enemy. And if you watch Ken Burns' documentary, Vietnam War, it's clear that these next generations, those individuals that lived during World War I and World War II, very much view the French as an enemy, that they're not welcome there. They're an outside invader, and that the Vietnamese want their own independence. And that's what is portrayed in that documentary. But the French now are an enemy because they have created an empire, and Vietnam happens to be part of their empire. One thing that the French do bring to this area, they do bring Roman Catholicism. Napoleon said that one of his reasons for expanding was to spread religion. So there is a pretty large Roman Catholic population in Southeast Asia as a result of that expansion. All right, so the French have Vietnam. They'll keep Vietnam until World War II. In the middle of French imperialism and World War II, there's a pretty key event, World War I. Now, in World War I, we've discussed it quite a bit this year. With World War I, it's mostly a European affair, but we have individual countries from all over the world getting involved. Vietnam, some individuals in Vietnam thought that World War I could help them gain their own independence, meaning force the French out. And one individual that felt that was this gentleman, Ho Chi Minh. He uses a lot of names in his life, but eventually he felt that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, his idea of self-determination, something we've discussed in class, would eventually help Vietnam gain their independence. And Ho Chi Minh wrote a letter to our president, Woodrow Wilson, at the end of World War I. Ken Burns describes this in his documentary, and I've provided a link to this site on Google Classroom. So episode 1, Ken Burns has a couple of clips on this website, PBS's website, that we want to use today. So I provided a link on Google Classroom. Here's the first one. I would like for you to stop this video right now, and go to PBS's website and watch this clip that's titled Ho Chi Minh's Letter. Okay, that letter was written 1918, 1919. Ho Chi Minh is 20-some years old. And his actual fighting for Vietnamese independence won't happen for another 40 years until World War II and in 1941. So Ho Chi Minh is a gentleman who, he's not living in Vietnam. He had been exiled, been kicked out. He's living in China. He was living in India. He was living in Paris. But he sees an opportunity at the end of World War I for Vietnamese independence. But he doesn't act upon it until 1941. When the other countries don't really help with removing the French, he becomes more active with an opportunity out of World War II. Now, a reminder, we've talked a lot about World War II. And I know we summarized some things, but you should have a pretty good understanding of what happened there. With World War II, we see appeasement. Appeasement does work. temporarily. Appeasement leads to aggression, and Hitler eventually becomes aggressive against Poland, and that causes, or is the last straw that causes World War II. Here on the left, you see the headline, Hitler invades Poland. Well, a reminder, when Hitler invaded Poland, the French and the British both declare war on Germany, and that is the official declarations of war that will start World War II. Well, now that France is waging war against Germany, they aren't going to put as much energy or resources in Vietnam. And now that the French are trying to just survive, because a reminder, at the beginning of the war, the Germans absolutely destroy them. Within a couple of months of declaring war, Paris falls. And as you see on this picture in the middle of Adolf Hitler standing in Paris in front of the Eiffel Tower, France falls. Their government runs away to London. Their government flees to the south to run a temporary government. France is barely surviving. And because the French are so weakened, the Axis power, Germany, Japan, Italy, see this as an opportunity to take more land. And the country that was trying to build an empire in Asia that we have discussed before is Japan. In 1940, Japan seizes this opportunity and invades Vietnam. The Japanese, once again, had built an empire throughout the late 19th century into the 20th century. We discussed their invasion of Korea just a couple weeks ago. We discussed their invasion into China, their war with Russia at the end of Tsar Nicholas II's time, which was part of the cause of the Russian Revolution. Japan sees this opportunity in 1940 during World War II to build a larger empire, and they conquer Vietnam. Well, out of Vietnam being part of World War II, Ho Chi Minh sees this as an opportunity for Vietnam to gain their independence. So once again, 1940, Japan invades Vietnam. September 1940, Japan controls Vietnam. The French are no longer in control. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh, the individual that you just watched that video about, that he gave the letter to President Wilson, Ho Chi Minh returns back from China, and he sees this as an opportunity for the Vietnamese people to rule themselves. If Japan can be overthrown, the French are out, and now his people can rule themselves. It's an opportunity for independence. In 1941, he returns to Vietnam from China. Here on the right is a picture of him when he was quite a bit younger. This is around World War I. And on the left, this is a picture dated in the 1940s. I can't confirm exactly when it's taken, but 1940s. And that's Ho Chi Minh on the right, wearing the shorts and the white shirt. And he begins this movement known as the Vietnamese Independence Movement. They become known as the Viet Minh. And one of his top assistants is pictured here. This is a gentleman who will eventually control most of his military. His previous career is he was a history teacher. Yeah, a history teacher. So the top assistant of Ho Chi Minh is a history teacher. Now, the reason we're focusing on Ho Chi Minh here is Ho Chi Minh will eventually lead a group that's known as the Viet Cong. So the Viet Minh eventually become the National Liberation Movement, but also become known as the Viet Cong. Ho Chi Minh in World War II is a friend of the United States. In 1950, he's an enemy of the United States because after the war, it'll be clear that he wants Vietnam to become communist. And we know what President Truman feels about communism. When Ho Chi Minh was deciding could they defeat the Japanese to gain their independence, he had to come up with a strategy. And the strategy that he and his top assistant, that history teacher, came up with was that they're going to fight guerrilla warfare. And one of the quotes from Ho Chi Minh is that his army was going to be everywhere and nowhere, meaning ambush and run, ambush and run, ambush and run. Well, why is this important? Well, later on in 1950s, when the United States starts to fight in Vietnam, they're going to fight against guerrilla warfare. We knew how they were going to fight. We should have prepared for that. It's hard to prepare for this. The other thing that's important about 1940 is the Viet Minh start to build these tunnels. And this underground living arrangement, this underground way of sneaking from one area of town to the next area of town, really intensifies their ability to fight guerrilla warfare. So in World War II, these two gentlemen decide that the Viet Minh at that time, were going to fight guerrilla warfare, and they have a little bit of success against the Japanese. But they fight guerrilla warfare because they know that there's no way they can defeat the Japanese on their own. Now, in any war, you look for allies. In World War II, Hitler allied himself with Italy and Japan. The French allied themselves with the British, the Soviet Union, later on the United States. Well, Vietnam, if they're going to defeat the Japanese, they wanted to ally themselves with the United States. So how do you ally yourself with the United States? In spring of 1945, Hitler's going to lose. Okay, we've already discussed this a little bit. The United States is into the war after Pearl Harbor. The United States helps with D-Day. Hitler's in a two-front war. Best way to fight it, don't. Hitler's going to lose. So now the United States starts to focus on their war in Japan. And here's a pretty cool picture. They're looking over a map of East Asia. We're pointing at Japan. And we have a couple of gentlemen that are looking in. The gentleman in the middle with the bow tie is our president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, a reminder that FDR is going to pass away right before the end of the war. The gentleman sitting next to FDR, closest to us, that's Douglas MacArthur. And you already know about Douglas MacArthur because of our study of the Korean War. So they're trying to figure out what to do with Japan. And they're searching for an ally. Well, who can they ally themselves with against the Japanese in Southeast Asia? Well, they can align themselves with Ho Chi Minh. FDR sends the OSS. So this is a secret. The OSS is the earliest form of the CIA. So this is undercover. This is not published. In World War II, the United States will send medical assistance to Ho Chi Minh because he was sick at the time. And they'll also send supplies to the Viet Minh to fight against the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh has a common enemy, and that enemy is Japan. Now, FDR, when he makes this agreement, Ho Chi Minh has to be his friend for a reason. Ho Chi Minh is promised by Franklin Roosevelt that after the war, FDR will do whatever he can to help Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese have an independent country. Ho Chi Minh agrees to help. FDR agrees to help Ho Chi Minh, and that is their agreement. But by the end of World War II, a lot of things changed. The first thing that changed in early to mid-April, April 12th, 1945, is FDR died. And when FDR died, Truman becomes the president. And Truman was a lot different than Roosevelt. Truman had a much different perspective on communism. Truman was a true believer in the domino theory. FDR, he wanted to win the war. So he needed the Viet Minh to defeat the Japanese to win the war. Truman, after the war is over, he has to create a world that is peaceful after the war. And his biggest threat to peace, in his mind, was communism. So FDR dies. That's a big change. The second thing that changes is how we fight war. In 1945, Truman decides to drop the atomic bombs. That changes everything. And after the war, Truman and the entire world has to decide how are they going to live in a nuclear age. Now we've discussed Yalta, the splitting of Germany, splitting of Korea. Well, what are they going to do with Vietnam? Because Vietnam used to be French, but it also was Japanese land, and it also is a land that wants its own independence. What do we do with Vietnam? After the war, on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh had never been seen in public. He marches into Hanoi, which is the largest city in northern Vietnam. It becomes the capital of North Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh marches in, gives a victorious speech, and declares their independence. What I'd like for you to do right now is I'd like for you to stop this video and go back to our PBS website. And on that PBS website, the second clip is titled The Declaration of Independence. Please watch that clip at this time. Okay, September 1945, the war's over. Allies have won. The losers are Italy, who had switched sides again. Germany, who had been split into 4 parts, and Japan. And what we mentioned with Korea, when we talked about the Korean War, is Japan had lost its territory after World War II. And with Japan losing territory after World War II, they had to decide to do what to do with Korea. Well, we remember that Korea was split north and south at the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviets controlled it. The south, the United States controlled it. Both left, power vacuum, war. Well, Vietnam, what do we do with Vietnam? In 1945 and in 1946, it was decided the same thing would happen with Vietnam. Vietnam would be split. It would be split, as you can see here on this map, at the 17th parallel. The north would be controlled by China. The south would be controlled by the British. So the allies that won were able to split this land. After a few years, they will have self-determination. They will choose a government for themselves. And here's the big question. This is the question that leads to the Vietnam conflict or Vietnam War. Should Vietnam be independent and govern themselves, or should Vietnam be returned to France because France controlled Vietnam and Indochina before World War II? That's the thing that needs to be decided. But temporarily, the country would be split. Ho Chi Minh will move to the north, and the south will have a mixed feeling about what's going to happen. But what we need to know about 1945, 1946 is the splitting of this country. Nobody's happy with that. By late fall of 1946, Ho Chi Minh once again was leading the north with the goal of Vietnamese reunification and independence. In the south, Charles de Gaulle wanted to take that back over. Charles de Gaulle is a leader of France. Once again, he's pretty much limping after World War II because they had to be bailed out by pretty much everybody. But late 1946, Charles de Gaulle decides that he's going to return his military to Indochina. And when he returns his military, it becomes inevitable that they're going to go to war. Ho Chi Minh is fighting for independence. Charles de Gaulle, is he fighting to take back his land, or is he fighting to create an empire? That's something that's been argued about. Well, each side are eventually going to look for global support. Ho Chi Minh believed that his ally would be the United States because FDR stated that he would help him with Vietnamese independence. But a reminder, FDR died. Truman viewed the world a lot different. And Truman wasn't exactly eager to help Ho Chi Minh with independence. And one reason that Truman didn't want to help, or was kind of hesitant to help Ho Chi Minh, is he didn't want to anger France. France had been an ally in other wars. The French had been allies World War I, World War II, and he didn't want to anger Charles de Gaulle. So Truman kind of hesitates. But one other individual doesn't hesitate, Joseph Stalin. Early on, Ho Chi Minh will receive military supplies and financial backing from the communist leader of the Soviet Union. And now that means in this early Cold War that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh have aligned themselves with communists. And Truman no longer can assist Ho Chi Minh or even think about it because he cannot align himself with communism. A reminder, in 1947, Truman releases the Truman Doctrine that communism cannot spread, but it does spread to China. Ho Chi Minh will also become an ally with his neighbor, China, and this leader, Mao Zedong. Once Ho Chi Minh has aligned himself with communists, Harry Truman must align himself with the French. Harry Truman decides that they're going to get involved, meaning the United States. Now, a reminder, in 1950, Harry Truman is trying to kind of save his reputation. He felt that he had lost China to communism, and he can't lose another country, and that country would be Vietnam. Truman, a reminder, in 1950, June of 1950, gets involved in Korea. When North Korea invades past the 38th parallel, he hires General MacArthur to fight communism back. 1 month later, in July of 1950, President Truman gives financial support, sends planes, sends jeeps, and 35 advisors to Vietnam. The United States said it would be neutral in this war. It wasn't. In 1950, the United States is involved in Vietnam. We don't have soldiers there, but we do have advisors and military equipment. We have chosen the side of the French in the Vietnam conflict. Now, Truman is the guy that got us into the war, but he's only the first president that's involved. There will be 5 different presidents that will be involved in the Vietnam conflict. Truman does not run for re-election 2 years later in 1952. Instead, the election is between Dwight D. Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day, and Adlai Stevenson. Now, you've already seen Stevenson in history. We discussed him during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he's an Illinois guy. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower dominates the election. Stevenson runs for president again in 56. He loses again to Eisenhower. Truman got us into Vietnam. The next person to make decisions on Vietnam, as well as in Korea, is Dwight Eisenhower. Our 34th president has to decide, do we get more involved or do we remove ourselves? In 1952, President Eisenhower ran on a platform that he'd be tough on communism. We will get more involved, and that will lead to a long and bloody conflict in Vietnam. Okay, that's it for today. Hopefully it wasn't too long. If you did get bored, sorry. Hopefully I gave you something to do. Once again, stay safe out there. Enjoy your family. Stay away from other people. And have a great day. Take care of those you love. We'll see you guys tomorrow.